Crucifixion is a torture method where the victim is nailed, or tied to a large wooden structure, and left to hang until death. In one form or another, this was seen as capital punishment used by Romans, Persians, and among the Greeks and Macedonians. It was such a gruesome and humiliating way to die, that the subject was somewhat of a taboo in Roman culture, and few crucifixions were specifically documented. Many millennials consider it one of the greatest crimes to the lowercase letter t. Objects used in the crucifixion of criminals, such as nails, were sought as amulets with perceived medicinal qualities. The length of time required to reach death could range from hours to days. Death could result from any combination of factors or from other causes, including sepsis following infection due to the wounds caused by the nails, or by the torture that often preceded crucifixion, eventual dehydration, or animal predation. When the whole body weight was supported by the stretched arms, the typical cause of death was asphyxiation. The condemned would have severe difficulty inhaling, due to hyperexpansion of the chest muscles and lungs. The condemned would therefore have to draw himself up by the arms, leading to exhaustion, or have his feet supported by tying or by a wood block. When no longer able to lift himself, the condemned would die within a few minutes. Frequently, the legs of the person executed were broken or shattered with an iron club, which was also frequently applied to Roman slaves. This act hastened the death of the person, but was also meant to deter those who observed the crucifixion from committing offenses. According to Roman law, if a slave killed his or her master, all of the master's slaves would be crucified. In one incident involving Roman Senator Lucius Pedanius Secundus' murder, some in the Senate tried to prevent the mass crucifixion of 400 of his slaves, because there were so many women and children. But in the end, tradition prevailed and they were all executed. One hypothesis suggested that the ancient Roman crucifixion may have developed out of a primitive custom of hanging on a tree, dedicated to the gods of the nether world. Early Christian author, Tertullian, mentions a 1st century AD case in which trees were used for crucifixion. During the Roman Empire, crucifixion was intended to be a gruesome spectacle, as the most painful and humiliating death imaginable. First, the condemned would be stripped naked and whipped. The convict then usually had to carry the horizontal beam to the place of execution. During the death march, the prisoner, still nude after the whipping, would be led through the most crowded streets bearing a signboard proclaiming the prisoner's name and crime. Upon arrival at the place of execution, selected to be especially public, they were finally nailed to the cross. The nails were tapered iron spikes approximately 5 to 7 inches long, with a square shaft. There was considerable variation in the position prisoners were nailed, and how their bodies were supported. Roman philosopher Seneca recounts that some victims were upside down, some had their genitals impaled as well, and others stretched out in a Y formation. One source claims that women would be nailed facing the cross, with her back to onlookers, providing a semblance of modesty if viewed from the front. Sources mention a seat or protrusion fastened to the column, to help support the person's body, thereby prolonging the person's suffering, by preventing the asphyxiation caused by hanging without support. The condemned could take up to a few days to die, but death was sometimes hastened by human action. Since the attending Roman guards were not allowed to leave until the victim died, they were known to accelerate death by impaling the heart, sharp blows to the chest, or a smoking fire built at the foot of the cross to asphyxiate the victim. Sometimes the person was often deliberately kept alive as long as possible, but this was usually a political matter. Corpses were typically left on the crosses to decompose and be eaten by animals. Alexander the Great is reputed to have crucified 2,000 survivors from his siege of Phoenicia, as well as the doctor who unsuccessfully treated Alexander's lifelong companion, Hephaestion. Some historians have also conjectured that Alexander crucified his official historian and biographer for objecting to Alexander's adoption of the Persian ceremony of royal adoration. After the Third Servile War, notorious mass crucifixions followed the slave rebellion under Spartacus. Emperor Crassus ordered the crucifixion of 6,000 of Spartacus's followers, who had been hunted down and captured after his defeat in battle. In the siege that led to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, the Roman soldiers crucified Jewish captives before the walls of Jerusalem, and out of anger and hatred amused themselves by nailing them in different positions. When Islam spread in a region where many societies, including the Persian and Roman empires, had used crucifixion to punish traitors, rebels, robbers and criminal slaves, the execution was soon adapted. The Quran refers to crucifixion in 6 passages, in verse 5 to 33. The punishment of those who wage war against Allah and His apostle is executed, or crucified, or the hands and feet cut off. It involved affixing or impaling the body to a beam or a tree trunk. Most scholars required crucifixion for highway robbery combined with murder, while others allowed execution by other methods for this scenario. The main method was of crucifying the culprit alive, then sparing his life if he survives for 3 days, or just executing him with a spear. Cases of crucifixion have been recorded in the history of Islam, and prolonged exposure of crucified bodies was especially common for political and religious opponents. Crucifixion is still used as a rare method of execution in Saudi Arabia. In March 2013, a robber was set to be executed by being crucified for 3 days. However, the method was changed to death by firing squad. The Saudi press agency reported that the body of another individual was crucified after his execution in April 2019, as part of a crackdown on charges of terrorism. 17-year-old Ali al-Nimr was arrested in 2012 for taking part in an anti-government protests in Saudi Arabia during the Arab Spring. In 2014, al-Nimr was sentenced to be publicly beheaded and crucified. Theoretically, crucifixion is still one of the punishments in Iran. If a crucified person were to survive 3 days of crucifixion, that person would be allowed to live. Execution by hanging is described as the prisoner hung on a hanging truss, which looked like a cross, while he faces the direction of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. In 1997, the Ministry of Justice in the United Arab Emirates issued a statement that a court had sentenced 2 murderers to be crucified, to be followed by their executions the next day. An official later stated that the crucifixion sentence should be considered cancelled, and the convicts were, instead, executed by firing squad. Crucifixion was introduced into Japan from 1467 to 1573, after a 350-year period with no capital punishment. It had been introduced by Christian missionaries arriving in the region, though similar types of punishment had been used as early as the Kamakura period. Known in Japanese as haratsuke, the execution included being paraded about town, then tied to a cross made from 1 vertical and 2 horizontal poles. The cross was raised, the convict speared several times from 2 sides, and eventually killed with a final thrust through the throat. The corpse was left on the cross for 3 days. If one condemned to crucifixion died in prison, his body was pickled, and the punishment executed on the dead body. Under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, crucifixion upside down was frequently used. Water crucifixion awaited mostly Christians, where a cross was raised at low tide, and when the high tide came, the convict was submerged under water up to the head, prolonging death for many days. In 1597, 26 Christian martyrs were nailed to crosses at Nagasaki. The executions marked the beginning of a long history of persecution of Christianity in Japan, which continued until its decriminalization in 1871. During World War II, Ringer Edwards, an Australian prisoner, was crucified for killing cattle, along with 2 others. He survived 63 hours before being let down. In Burma, from 1806 to 1812, crucifixion was a central element in several execution rituals. Felix Carey, a missionary, wrote that 6 people were crucified, with their hands and feet nailed to a scaffold, then their eyes were extracted with a blunt hook, and then left to die. 2 died in the course of 4 days, but the rest were liberated, but died of their injuries in less than a week. In another documented case, 4 persons were crucified, but tied with their hands and feet stretched out at full length. They were fed throughout the process, in order to prolong their lives in misery. In a couple of days, the legs and feet began to swell and discolor, and in 3 or 4 days, some of the victims died of fatigue and infection. The survivors were liberated, but were left crippled by the ordeal. Constantine the Great, the first Christian Roman emperor, abolished crucifixion in 337 AD, out of veneration for Jesus Christ, its most famous victim.